Hi Chamber Strings, I miss you. We are doing these videos for you guys as artists in residences, and we're gonna do it every week. And the first one I'm gonna do is on spiccato. Since we suddenly have all this time available, it's a good time to check in with just some technique things that usually we're kind of like pushing to the side because we're trying to get through our repertoire and everything. So today we're just gonna look at spiccato, and this lesson will work for you whether you haven't done spiccato before or whether you're already pretty proficient at it and you're looking at wanting to get even better. So we're gonna kind of start at the beginning and then go through. And this is just something you can incorporate into your warm-up or into your practice. I'm trying to think, in the repertoire that we have right now, spiccato would be good for St. Paul's Suite, but it wasn't really invented until the later 18th century with the modern tort bow, so it doesn't really work in a Baroque setting. We usually do more of a like SOTA stroke and Baroque music, but anyway, so let's get down to it here. So basically, when we're thinking about a bow stroke, there's four elements to consider. There's the speed of your bow, there's the weight of your bow, there's the sounding point, and there's the tilt, maybe, like how far rolled over you are. And then what makes spiccato difficult is that we're actually adding a fifth element, which is height. And it will be up to us to figure out how much height is needed and how much horizontal motion is needed to get the sound that we're looking for. Spiccato means to separate, and it's basically a bouncy stroke that comes off the string, which if you remember when you very first started playing, your bow probably bounced a lot and you didn't mean for it to. So now we're going to kind of rein in that bounce and see if we can control it. Okay, so step one actually begins with just your bow hold. Spiccato doesn't work very well, or at all, if you have stiffness in your bow hand or if you have a straight pinky. So, and this is true, I'm obviously going to be demonstrating on my violin, but it works the same way for cello and bass. So first, check your bow hand. Make sure that your fingers are rounded and that your pinky, for violins and violas, sits up on the top like this. And then we're going to think about also where our elbow is and where our wrist is. So we don't want to play here with the elbow down because that's going to be adding weight into the bow that we don't want. So as we're practicing, you want to make sure that your elbow stays up like a tabletop and that your wrist, if anything, is more like this, not like this. But the best would be if it was just in a straight line, just like that. Okay, so let's start just by setting up, and we're going to have the stroke begin with our big muscle, our shoulder, and the wrist and hand are just gonna follow, okay? And we're just gonna do little tiny strokes. Good. So you can probably see that my hand is moving like that, but I'm not directing the bow to move from my hand like this. I'm using my shoulder, and the hand's just following. Later, we're going to talk about colle, which is the stroke that you actually do from bending your fingers and straightening them out. Okay, so the next thing that we should think about too is the balance point. So you already know this, but balance point is where your bow balances, and it's usually closer to the frog than to the tip because the frog's so heavy. That's going to be our starting point for spiccato, but of course, first of all, everyone's bow is weighted a little bit differently, and you can do spiccato out here and down here. It's just going to have a different sound, but we're going to just start at the balance point because that's kind of the easiest place to start. Okay. So we're going to set it the same way we did with our arm moving. Just repeat that exercise. I'm just doing open A. You're checking in, making sure that your hand is relaxed. And now we're just going to add a little bit of height, okay? Because before we were doing all horizontal, and now we're going to add a little bit of vertical, okay? And to make it even easier, we can start with the bow lifted up off the string, which is the only time I'm ever going to tell you you can do that. Okay. So this sound is not good, but that's okay, because we're just working on adding some height, that fifth element, to our bow stroke. Good. So once you get that pretty steady and you're like, all right, give me the next layer, then we're gonna get a little closer to the string. So further away, then closer. And what happens as you get closer to the string, it's kind of like if you were bouncing a ball. And shocker, I don't own a basketball, so I can't show you, but imagine you're dropping a ball from here. The bounce is a lot slower, right? But if you're going to drop it really close to the ground, you go, and the same thing works with your bow as well. So slower bounce, bigger stroke, smaller, quicker, and that's the stroke that we're looking for. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about troubleshooting, because all of you can do some spiccato, but you probably have different struggles. So the trouble that I hear about the most is having an uneven spiccato, which kind of would sound like, you're like, I can do it, I'm coming up off the string, but it's not even. So the biggest cause of an uneven spiccato is tension, either in your hand, in your fingers, or like in your forearm somewhere. So you want to make sure that you lift your shoulders up and drop them, and that you're not holding a shoulder up high. You want to make sure that this hand is set up really nicely. You don't have tension in your hand. And then you just work to relax your arm. So remember too, as you're doing this, that the bow is designed to bounce, the modern bow. It wants to bounce, but sometimes we get in its way by trying to control the bounce too much, like, but if you just let it kind of do its thing, and the arm doesn't get in its way, and the hand doesn't get in its way, it will bounce very nicely. Another thing that people will struggle with a little bit too is like a scratchy tone, like. And you can probably see that my bow is way too close to my bridge, and I also have like a lot of vertical motion. So you have to explore a little bit this plane of your instrument and make sure that you're not too close to your bridge and you're not too high. But rather you're out here kind of in between the fingerboard and the bridge. But you can totally experiment with where it sounds best to you. And depending on the repertoire too. Sometimes you want that grittier sound, and other times you want it to be really light. Okay, so let's go back to basics for a second here before we add on a more advanced layer. So if you think about, okay, my arm is a string, and this is gonna be your bow, okay? The bow comes like this on the string, and it makes this type of shape. If we want a more percussive or like crisp shape, we want a little bit more of a V where the bow is like chopping into the string a little bit more. And if we want more of a soft, rounder, more resonant sound, then we're gonna want a little bit of a shallower motion. You could also think about it as like the V has more vertical, V for vertical, motion. And the U shape has a little bit more horizontal motion. And with spiccato, we're always trying to like fight against like the vertical and the horizontal and kind of marry the two in a way that sounds good. Okay, so then we need to think about the amount that our bow is tipped. So let's start with the bow just totally flat on the strings. You can kind of take a peek and make sure that all the hairs are touching your string. And then we're gonna experiment a little bit just with flat hair. Okay, now let's turn it a little bit away from us, so with the stick away, just a little bit. And then let's turn it even more. Okay, good. So we're never gonna actually come back with the stick pointing to us. That's not gonna ever be an option, but experiment with flat, tipped, and then tipped more. And then the next experiment we can do is on this plane that I talked about a little bit before, the sounding point. So let's start with the bow over the fingerboard, okay? Very soft, not very crisp, but sometimes that's what you want. Like maybe you're playing second violin in a quartet and you're just there to kind of be texture. Okay, then let's bring it back a little bit. More crisp, right? And then back more. Now we're starting to get more grit and more percussive sound. And then that's awful. Not to say that you wouldn't sometimes want that sound, like certain moments of Shostakovich call for that grit, but in general we don't want to play so close to the bridge, right? Okay. That's pretty much it for the basics of spiccato. It just takes a lot of experimentation with your bow on your instrument, but there's just some big things I want you to remember to check in with. The biggest one is your posture. That's kind of why we want to make sure that your posture is set up really well and that your bow is relaxed. Spiccato is this like very essential articulation that we have and bow technique that we have, but everything has to kind of be in place before we can do it. And the much you can is really very fun. And there's a lot of different options to play around with. But that being said, it's not possible unless you've kind of addressed some of these maybe bad habits that you have beforehand. But sometimes that's motivating because you're like, oh, that's why it should be that way. So I can do this thing, not just, you know, for some arbitrary reason. Okay, so now it's time to get into the next step, which is once you have your spiccato and you're like, sounds pretty good, what's next? Next is adding colle to the spiccato, because that gives you even more control over like precisely where certain things are gonna land. So let's talk a little bit about colle. This is a fun stroke. So set your bow at the frog, and you're only gonna move the bow by straightening your fingers and bending your fingers. Straightening them and bending them. Okay, so you're not allowed to use your wrists or your arm or anything else. Or like, okay, so here. That's colle. And you can do it anywhere in the bow. That's just kind of the most extreme. You do it at the tip. Oh, you can't see my hand. I'm totally doing it though. And so if you can integrate that into your spiccato, specifically at the beginning of every stroke, then your spiccato is going to go to the next level. So let me play something for you with not using colle at all, and you'll hear the difference between the two of them. Okay. Just spiccato, and it's fine, but I feel a little bit at the mercy of just the bounce, and I don't have a whole lot of control about like the attack of my spiccato. So now if I start integrating colle into that, then suddenly, we'll see if you can even hear it on the video, but suddenly I'm a little bit more in charge of what's going on with my stroke. Is now every single one of my spiccato notes actually has a clear start and finish, and I'm controlling where that is. So I told you before that if you're just starting out with spiccato and this is still kind of new for you and you're just trying to find like how much vertical, how much horizontal, like go ahead and start with your bow off the string, because it'll just bounce, like even if you're super careless with it, like But if you're ready for the next level of spiccato and you're ready to add some colle, now your spiccato is going to start on the string. And it starts with that colle. And the entire time I'm spiccatoing, I'm moving now suddenly a lot more with my fingers and controlling a lot more with my fingers. So experiment with this. The three elements to experiment with are bow tilt, sounding point, well, okay, more than three, height, and horizontal motion. And the biggest thing you want to work on is making sure that you can get it really even. So the last exercise I'm going to leave you with is this very exciting one that you're going to do with the metronome. So you turn your metronome on. I'm going to turn mine on to my most favorite speed, which is 88. Okay. So you're going to start out with quarter notes. So while you're doing your quarter notes, that's the time to be like, is my hand relaxed? Okay, just so you know. Okay, now we're gonna do eighth notes. We're doing that one. You're like, okay, less vertical now, time to get a little closer to the strings, we're bouncing faster, right? Okay, so then the next one, you're gonna do triplets. Even closer string. I'm also rushing, I'm sorry. Okay, and then you're gonna do 16th notes. Okay, good. And then once you're at 16th notes, now you're doing spiccato. Good job, you. But that's what I want you to practice. That's what I want you to work on this week is spiccato. And I did it on open A just to make it sound all the same, so I'm not adding in like other elements while I'm trying to get you to hear the difference. But you can do scales, you could play Twinkle Twinkle, you could do an entire piece just with spiccato, but it just takes practice like anything. And it's helpful if you kind of have some like checklist, like, oh, I finally got it even on my quarter notes, now time to go on to my eighth notes. So you're not just like, I'm gonna learn this stroke and I'm gonna be good at it right now, because it doesn't really work that way. So thanks for tuning in. Again, I miss you guys a lot. I hope you're doing well. I'm glad that you all have instruments to keep you busy and your mind occupied. Email me whenever you want to talk about anything music. You can send me videos of you playing a thing and you can be like, help me with this thing. I'll help you with that thing. My email address is mduggan@Tacoma blah 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 blah. Yeah. And if you're searching for me, you have to search for Margaret, because that's my name. Okay, I'll see you guys later. Bye.